There are 4 scheduled executions in 4 states this week, including a Louisiana inmate who was put to death on Tuesday by nitrogen gas, a method that's actually banned in the state for putting pets to sleep.
It'll be the first for Louisiana after Alabama carried out the first nitrogen gas execution in the world last year and has since executed 4 more people by that method. And the inmates are strapped to a gurney, and then a gas mask is placed over their face that emits nitrogen gas.
Yeah, so inhaling pure nitrogen is deadly, and so nitrogen hypoxia, which is what this process is called, deprives your body of oxygen and slowly suffocates you to death. And the nitrogen is supposed to knock you out, but all the prisoners who were sentenced to this showed signs of distress. They shook violently, writhed and convulsed on the gurney for about 2 minutes as they were forced to breathe these toxins through a mask.
And this isn't the only groundbreaking execution method being tested these days. I think we were all shocked when a South Carolina man was killed via firing squad just a couple weeks ago. It was actually the first time in over 15 years that was used.
And what was even more unheard of is that he actually got to choose his method of execution. So he obviously chose firing squad over a 110-year-old electric chair and lethal injection.
Behind the chair that was used for the firing squad in the room, you could see the electric chair, but apparently the gurney used for injections had been rolled away.
The firing was carried out by 3 volunteer prison employees.
What does volunteer mean?
They used rifles and stood 15 feet away from where the inmates sat in the state's death chamber, and that's about the distance of like a backboard from a free throw line in basketball.
Yeah, they aimed at the inmate's chest and fired at the same time through openings in the wall, and I guess a dozen witnesses watched on in a room separated by bulletproof glass, including the victim's family and the inmate's lawyer.
Wow, yeah, I can't believe that the victim's family was there. Like, I wonder if I'd want to go to that.
Well, I guess, like, imagine if someone killed your parents, which is what happened in this case. Like, it's kind of justice.
Yeah, I can see like the sense of satisfaction and justice that would come from seeing something like that, especially because these death row trials go on for so long. Like this specific South Carolina one started in 2001, so I'm sure there is some relief kind of seeing that end.
Well, last week, Idaho became the first state to make firing squad its preferred method of execution starting next year.
And we reached out to the Idaho Department of Corrections for comment, and they said that they're in the process of retrofitting their maximum security prison to accommodate the firing squad. And there's reporting that they're having a hard time finding a contractor to build out the facility because I guess nobody really wants to be associated with that.
And they made this switch after the state was unable to execute one of the longest serving death row inmates in the country 8 times. They failed 8 times to establish an IV line, which is needed to deliver the lethal injection drugs.
And lethal injection is definitely the most popular form of execution in the US. There have been 1,428 in the last 50 years, but lethal injections also have the highest rate of botched injections at 7%, and there's been a lot of evidence that it causes severe pain and respiratory distress.
A review of autopsies of prisoners who were put to death via lethal injection found that 84% showed evidence of pulmonary edema, which is a fluid buildup in the lungs that creates the feeling of suffocation or drowning that experts have likened to waterboarding. And in some of them, there were indications that the person was still alive as their lungs filled with fluid.
I mean, that's terrifying. And apparently some of these drugs that are supposed to render the inmate unconscious aren't dosed properly enough or aren't strong enough. So a lot of these anesthetic drug companies are now being sued, which of course makes these companies even less likely to want to supply drugs. So currently we're in a lethal drug injection shortage.
Well, to try to fix that, Trump signed a sweeping order hours after returning to the White House that directs the Attorney General to take all necessary and lawful action to ensure that states have enough lethal injection drugs to carry out executions.
In Trump's first term, his administration carried out 13 federal executions, which is more than any president in modern history. And this term, he's clearly still pushing for that.
I've already signed an executive order requiring a mandatory death penalty for anyone who murders a police officer. And tonight I'm asking Congress to pass that policy into permanent law.
Which is controversial since public support for the death penalty is at a 5-decade low of 52%.
And not just the US, but around the world. So in 1999, the UN passed a resolution supporting a worldwide moratorium on executions. And now roughly 50 countries still actively use the death penalty. Most are carried out by Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, which is actually the leading country in executions, and the US.
So we're speaking to Robin Marr, the executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center, about the new execution methods, the high botched rates, and what we can expect under the Trump administration. Last week, South Carolina executed an inmate via firing squad. And then Idaho just adopted firing squad as its main execution method. So why are we seeing this method being preferred by states?
Yeah, it's a really unusual development. Firing squad has been used historically for many years, mostly by the military, but also by a number of the states in the past. South Carolina decided that it would adopt the firing squad as one of three methods, and it gave the prisoner, Brad Sigmund, a choice of choosing among those three methods. He chose the firing squad because it was the most straightforward method of execution he had the most information about. You can imagine being asked to choose how you are going to die. So he really kind of defaulted to the firing squad.
We saw that volunteer prison employees carried out the firing. What
Yep.
does that mean? Who are these people that are shooting him?
Right. So in South Carolina, they made the job available to prison staff. Prison staff could volunteer to be one of the riflemen. And that's what happened. In Idaho, I understand they're planning to use an automated firing squad. So there'll be no human beings behind those guns, which I think would probably lessen some of the trauma that we understand a lot of prison staff experience when they participate in executions. It's a government function that is fraught with a lot of problems because of the secrecy that surrounds so much of what happens and because of the feelings that people have about executions and how divided people are about whether there should be executions and how they should be conducted.
We saw that the first execution using nitrogen gas in the world, is this right, happened last year. And it sounds like every single time the person is kind of convulsing while they're slowly dying.
I mean, nobody ever thought we would be using nitrogen gas to smother people to death. And if you listen to the state of Alabama, its officials are saying, well, these executions are going like textbook. They go perfectly well with no problems. But all the media witnesses that attend these executions are saying something very different. They're saying that the prisoners appear to be in a great deal of distress and pain during these executions. All of the active death penalty states refuse to tell the public critical information about how they're conducting executions. It's a real problem.
Talking about lethal injections, it seemed like for the longest time it was the most humane way, I guess, to carry out the death penalty. But we're seeing a lot of reporting, including on your website, about botched injections. What are the issues?
Problem with lethal injection has been that states have used untested combinations of drugs. Some of the drugs have been expired. Some of the execution staff are not medically trained, and so they make mistakes. And sometimes there are underlying physical conditions of the prisoner that create additional complications, all of which leads to what we call botched executions. And that is a display of pain and suffering that many people say is an unconstitutional kind of torture.
Do you ever hear a governor say, well, we have to, or any lawmaker say, well, we have to think about the pain and suffering of the inmate? Or is the mentality kind of like, well, they deserve it. Like they murdered this person. Who cares?
Yeah, well, there are both sides represented by public officials. What we saw most recently was that Attorney General Merrick Garland, on one of the last days he had in office, withdrew the federal protocol, which was using a one-drug protocol of pentobarbital, precisely because he said he was not satisfied that it wouldn't cause pain and suffering. Now, this new administration, I think, will probably put that protocol back into place. But we have seen those expressions of concern from a lot of officials and, of course, from a lot of judges. The legal standard to challenge a method of execution is very, very high. Our Supreme Court has now made a standard that is so very high that it's almost impossible to meet. No one has met it yet. And the Supreme Court has never invalidated a single form of execution. So, in the history of the United States, no method has ever been found to be unconstitutional. That's pretty breathtaking.
We read on the death penalty information website that there's kind of like surges and wanings of society being more prone to choosing the death penalty over other punishments. Like, what is happening in the world right now that is causing this resurgence?
Well, I guess I would say it's not really a resurgence. I mean, I think what we're seeing is a lot of coverage of the death penalty in the media for very good reasons. We're using all of these new methods of execution. There's a lot of curiosity about it, some even fascination with the fact that we're using the firing squad again, maybe because of this new administration, maybe because President Trump is a big fan of the death penalty.
We know in Trump's first administration, he executed more people than any other modern president. What can we expect in the next 4 years?
Well, there aren't many people left on the federal death row. President Biden commuted 37 sentences, death sentences, out of 40 people on the federal death row. There are only 3 people there left, and none of them are eligible for an execution date unless there's a change in the law. So he's really not left with anybody to execute. There are a couple of people on the military death row, but really where all the action is now is in the states. I mean, remembering that using the death penalty is a choice. It's a choice in every jurisdiction. There are other methods of punishing people and deterring future violence that don't involve using the death penalty. We can put people in prison for long periods of time. That, by the way, is a cheaper option in every jurisdiction. It costs a tremendous amount of taxpayer funding to secure a death sentence and to go forward with an execution. And each legislature needs to evaluate whether the public is going to approve of the cost and the way that they are going to be conducting these executions. Again, the scrutiny by the media, by the public is so important. Secrecy is the enemy in that we don't understand enough about what's happening.